The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of James Mitchell's modest apartment in Chicago, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floor. At 26, James had grown accustomed to living paycheck to paycheck, balancing his job as a high school English teacher with evening shifts at a local bookstore to make ends meet. His apartment, a small one-bedroom in Rogers Park, was sparsely furnished with second-hand pieces, but it was his, and he took pride in that independence. The manila envelope that arrived that morning lay open on his kitchen counter, its contents spread out beside his half-empty coffee mug. He read the letter for the fourth time, still unable to fully process its implications. As the sole beneficiary of your Uncle Harold Mitchell's estate, you are hereby entitled to assets valued at approximately $27 million, including investments, properties, and liquid assets. James had met his Uncle Harold perhaps 3 times in his life. The last encounter had been at his father's funeral 7 years ago, a brief, awkward exchange of condolences before Harold disappeared back into his reclusive life. Harold had been the black sheep of the family, estranged from his brother, James's father, for reasons never fully explained to the younger generation. The phone on the counter buzzed with an incoming call. It was Martin Greenberg, the attorney who had sent the documents. "Mr. Mitchell? I wanted to confirm you received the paperwork I sent over." "Yes," James managed, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "I got it. Excellent. I understand this must be quite shocking. Your uncle was a very private man about his financial affairs. Few people knew the extent of his success in the tech industry before he retired." "I barely knew him," James admitted. "That may be so, but he knew about you. He followed your career choice with interest. He mentioned your decision to become a teacher despite, and I quote, the Mitchell family's obsession with status and wealth." The attorney cleared his throat. "I believe he saw something of himself in you." After scheduling a meeting for the following day to begin the transfer process, James hung up and sank into his second-hand couch, mind racing. $27 million. The number seemed abstract, disconnected from reality. It was more money than he had ever imagined possessing. Could change everything: where he lived, how he lived, who he could become. The thought sent an unexpected wave of anxiety through him. James had built his identity around being self-sufficient, around the purposeful work of teaching literature to teenagers who alternated between boredom and occasional brilliant moments of engagement. What would this money make him? Another rich man in a city full of them, defined by wealth rather than character or contribution. His phone buzzed again. A text from his roommate from graduate school, Derek. "Still on for trivia night at O'Malley's? Marcus and Tanya are coming too." James stared at the message. His friends, all teachers or nonprofit workers, all living with the same financial constraints he had known until today. What would they think when they learned about his inheritance? Would their dynamics change? Would they see him differently? On impulse, James made a decision. He would tell no one, not yet. He would take time to figure out what this inheritance meant, what he wanted to do with it, before letting it change how the world perceived him. "Definitely," he texted back. "See you at 7. That evening at O'Malley's, a neighborhood pub with sticky floors and reasonably priced beer, James found himself studying his friends with new awareness. They debated literature and politics with the same passion they always had, complained about administrative decisions at their respective schools, and celebrated small victories with their students. "Earth to James," Tanya said, waving her hand in front of his face. "Your turn to get the next round." "Sorry," he said, reaching for his wallet and automatically calculating whether he could afford another round without dipping into his emergency fund. A habit he no longer needed but wasn't ready to break. "You okay?" Marcus asked as James returned with the pitcher. "You seem distracted." "Just tired," James lied. "End of semester grading." As the night progressed, James made his decision. He would keep his inheritance secret for now, living as he always had while he figured out what to do. It would be an experiment of sorts, a chance to see the world from both sides before committing to either. The next day, after meeting with the attorney and signing numerous documents, James opened a new bank account for the initial transfer of funds, separate from his existing checking account. He would continue to use his old account, with its familiar constraints, for daily expenses. Most clients in your position immediately ask about wealth management services, Martin commented, seeming puzzled by James's lack of questions about investment strategies. I'll get to that, James assured him. I just need some time to process this first. As he left the attorney's office, James felt the weight of his secret, both a burden and, strangely, a freedom. For the first time in his life, money was not an obstacle, yet he had chosen to maintain the familiar boundaries of his teacher's salary. The question that would drive the coming months took shape in his mind. Would wealth change who he fundamentally was, or would he be able to change what wealth meant in his life? Walking back to the L train that would take him home, James noticed details of the city he'd passed 1,000 times before. The contrast between the gleaming financial district towers and the homeless man setting up his cardboard shelter in the shadow of abundance. Both worlds were now theoretically accessible to him, yet he felt suspended between them, an observer of a social divide he had unexpectedly been given the power to cross at will. His phone buzzed again, a reminder about tomorrow's faculty meeting. Normal life continued, even as everything had changed. James boarded the train, choosing to stand rather than take one of the few empty seats. A small act of consideration he wondered if he would remember to make if luxury and convenience became his daily reality. 3 weeks into his experiment, James settled into a peculiar double life. By day, he continued teaching English literature at Westside High School, arriving early to help struggling students and staying late for drama club rehearsals. He still bought coffee from the discount shop across from the school, still brought packed lunches, and still commiserated with colleagues about budget cuts to the arts program. But now, every other evening and on weekends, James met with financial advisors, estate managers, and philanthropy consultants, gradually learning to navigate the mechanics of wealth. He had rented a small, furnished apartment downtown under a holding company name, a private space where he could review documents and take meetings without risking discovery by friends or colleagues. "Your approach is unusual," remarked Sonia Williams, the financial advisor recommended by Martin. Her office overlooked Millennium Park, a view James suspected cost more per square foot than his entire Rogers Park apartment. Most new wealth clients are eager to upgrade their lifestyle immediately. "I'm not most clients," James replied, reviewing the portfolio she had prepared. "I want to understand what this money means before I start spending it." "Understanding is good," Sonia nodded, "but experience is also educational. You won't really know how wealth impacts your life until you allow some changes." James considered this. Maybe small changes then, ones that don't announce themselves to everyone around me. That weekend, James made his first significant purchase, a comfortable ergonomic mattress to replace the lumpy futon he'd slept on since graduate school. It was a private luxury, visible to no one but transformative to his daily comfort. The delivery men struggled up the narrow staircase to his apartment, clearly wondering why someone ordering such an expensive item lived in such a modest building. "Special occasion?" one asked as they set up the frame. "Something like that," James answered vaguely. At school, the spring semester progressed with its familiar rhythms. James's junior English class was studying The Great Gatsby, and the irony of teaching about the corrupting influence of wealth while secretly possessing millions wasn't lost on him. "So what's Fitzgerald really saying about the American dream?" he asked his class of 30 diverse Chicago teenagers, most from working-class families. "That it's fake," offered Zoe, a bright student who rarely spoke up. "Gatsby got everything he thought he wanted. The money, the house, but it didn't get him Daisy or happiness." "It's not that the dream is fake," countered Marcus, a basketball player with unexpected literary insights. "It's that Gatsby tried to buy his way in instead of earning respect. Money can't buy belonging." James let the discussion flow, struck by how his students' observations echoed his own internal debates. Was he Gatsby now, an imposter in his own life, concealing his changed circumstances from those around him? After class, James headed to the faculty lounge, where discussions centered on the fundraiser for the school's summer arts program. Budget cuts meant they needed to raise $15,000 to continue offering theater, music, and visual arts classes to students who couldn't afford summer camps or private lessons. "We're at about $3,000 with the bake sale and car wash," sighed Elaine, the art teacher. "At this rate, we'll be washing cars until August." James felt the uncomfortable weight of his secret. He could write a check and solve the problem instantly, but that would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he offered, "I might have an idea. Let me make a few calls." That evening, at his downtown apartment, James contacted Martin. "I need to make an anonymous donation to a school program. Is that possible?" "Of course," the attorney replied. "We can route it through your uncle's foundation. It's still active and has been making educational grants for years. No one would connect it to you personally." A week later, the principal announced at a staff meeting that the Horizon Foundation had granted the school $20,000 for its summer arts program. "Who did you know to pull that off?" Derek asked James afterward, clearly impressed. "Just sent some emails to foundations focused on arts education." James shrugged, deflecting the question while technically not lying. As spring turned to summer, James continued his compartmentalized existence. He still lived frugally in most aspects visible to his friends, but had begun making changes that aligned with his values. He set up automatic monthly donations to the food pantry where he had occasionally volunteered. He upgraded his health insurance to a plan with better mental health coverage, something he had always believed should be accessible to everyone. The most significant shift came when his friend Tanya faced a crisis. Her mother in Detroit needed specialized medical care not covered by insurance, with costs estimated at $30,000. "I'm starting a GoFundMe," she told their friend group over dinner at their usual cheap pizza place, "and looking into second mortgage options for Mom's house." James felt physically ill at the thought of Tanya's family facing potential financial ruin while he sat on millions. That night, he called Martin again. "Another anonymous donation?" the attorney asked, now accustomed to these requests. "Yes, but more complicated. It needs to look like multiple donors to a medical fundraiser." 2 days later, Tanya called James, her voice breaking with emotion. "People I don't even know are donating. Someone from Mom's church shared it with a community foundation, and now there's been this cascade of support. We're already past $25,000. James felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief for Tanya, satisfaction at having helped, but also discomfort with his deception. This power to solve problems with money while remaining invisible behind it created a strange new dynamic, one where he held influence without transparency. That weekend, sitting alone in his downtown apartment surrounded by financial statements and grant proposals, James reflected on the past 2 months. His experiment had shown him that wealth could be deployed meaningfully, but the secrecy was creating an increasing distance between himself and those he cared about. Every conversation now contained an unspoken dimension. Every relationship was partly built on a significant omission. His phone buzzed with a group text, his friends planning a 4th of July gathering at the lakefront. Normal life continued to call him back to authenticity, even as his resources pushed him toward expanding possibilities. James realized his experiment was entering a new phase, one where he would need to begin integrating these divided aspects of his life or risk losing himself entirely in the gap between them. By mid-July, the strain of James's double life began showing hairline fractures. He had maintained his modest apartment and teaching lifestyle, but subtle changes accumulated like pebbles threatening an avalanche. He no longer checked price tags when grocery shopping. He had replaced his ancient laptop with a top-of-line model, explaining to curious colleagues that he'd found an amazing deal online. When Derek's car broke down, James had remembered a mechanic friend who could fix it at cost. In reality, paying the full repair bill himself through an elaborate arrangement with the auto shop. Each small deception added weight to his growing discomfort. Meanwhile, the wealth management side of his life expanded. James had established a formal charitable foundation, separate from his uncle's, focused on educational equity. He'd made his first angel investment in an educational technology startup founded by a former teacher. And he'd finally allowed himself one significant luxury, a lakefront condo purchased through a holding company. Though he hadn't yet moved in, unsure how to explain the upgrade to friends. The inevitable collision of his worlds came from an unexpected direction. "We need to talk about your plans for fall semester," Principal Garcia said, closing her office door after asking James to stay after the summer faculty meeting. "I've noticed you haven't signed your contract renewal." James shifted uncomfortably. He'd been postponing the decision, torn between his love for teaching and the expanding possibilities his foundation work presented. "I'm still considering my options," he admitted. Principal Garcia studied him with the perceptive gaze that had made her an effective school leader for 15 years. "James, you're one of our best teachers. The students connect with you, but lately you seem divided. Is everything okay?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly broke his careful compartmentalization. James considered telling her everything, but settled for a partial truth. "I've been offered an opportunity to work with an educational foundation. It would mean leaving classroom teaching, at least temporarily." "I see," she nodded. "Better compensation, I imagine?" "It's not about the money," James insisted, the irony of the statement not lost on him. "It's about potential impact. The foundation could fund programs that reach thousands of students." "Noble aims," Principal Garcia acknowledged. "But remember, impact isn't always about scale. Sometimes it's about depth." She leaned forward. "Whatever you decide, I hope it brings you fulfillment. You seem to be searching for something lately." That evening, troubled by the conversation, James decided to visit his new condo, a space he'd furnished but barely occupied. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, he called his sister Kate, the only family member he had seriously considered telling about his inheritance. "Can we meet for coffee tomorrow?" he asked. "I need some perspective on something important." The next morning at an upscale cafe downtown, far from his usual haunts where he might encounter colleagues, James finally shared his secret with Kate. $27 million? She repeated, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips. "From Uncle Harold? The same Uncle Harold who wore the same 3 sweaters for the 15 years I knew him. Apparently he sold his software company for much more than anyone in the family realized," James explained. "And yes, I've been keeping it secret since April." Kate set down her cup, shaking her head. I don't even know what that is. Crazy, amazing, slightly concerning that you've been living a double life for months." "All of the above," James admitted. "I needed time to figure things out before everyone started seeing me differently." "And have you figured things out?" James stared into his coffee. "Not entirely. I've learned I can do good things with the money without announcing it to the world. But the secrecy is becoming its own problem. I'm not being authentic with the people I care about." "Including your students?" "Especially them. I teach literature, Kate. We talk about truth, integrity, authenticity, while I'm living this elaborate deception." Kate studied her brother thoughtfully. "You know what strikes me? Most people who suddenly get rich immediately change their external circumstances. Bigger house, fancy car, exotic vacations. You've changed nothing visible but are wrestling with the internal questions most wealthy people never bother to ask. Is that good or bad?" "It's very you," she smiled. "But maybe it's time to start bringing these two worlds together on your own terms." Their conversation was interrupted by a voice calling James's name. He looked up to see Marcus, one of his colleagues from school, approaching their table with a woman James didn't recognize. "Thought that was you," Marcus said, then registered the upscale setting with slight surprise. "Nice place. We're just grabbing coffee before heading to the art festival." "This is my sister Kate," James explained quickly. "She's treating me for my birthday." The lie came automatically, another small stone added to the growing pile. After an awkward exchange of pleasantries, Marcus and his companion left for another table. James exhaled slowly, aware of Kate's raised eyebrow. "That's getting harder, isn't it?" she observed. "Increasingly so," James acknowledged. Later that week, the collision James had been avoiding happened in earnest. The Chicago Education Journal published a feature on emerging philanthropists in the education space. James had given an interview about his foundation's mission, carefully avoiding personal details, but the reporter had connected dots he hadn't anticipated. James Mitchell, 26, comes from a technology fortune and has established the Mitchell Education Initiative with a reported initial endowment of $10 million. The article read, Mitchell, who has taught English at Westside High School for the past 4 years, aims to bridge the gap between classroom experience and systemic reform. The article included a professional photo of James that he provided for the foundation's website, dressed in a suit that none of his colleagues had ever seen him wear. His phone began buzzing with texts almost immediately after the article went online. "Is this you?" From Derek with a screenshot of the article. "OMG James, why didn't you tell us?" From Tanya. And from Principal Garcia, simply, "My office tomorrow morning, please." That evening, James sat in his Rogers Park apartment, the place that had represented his commitment to maintaining his pre-wealth identity, and faced the reality that his experiment had reached its conclusion. Tomorrow would require honesty, explanations, perhaps apologies. His carefully maintained boundaries had collapsed, and he would need to navigate the consequences. He packed a small bag with essentials, looking around at the modest space that had been his home. Whatever happened next, he was crossing a threshold. The question that had driven his experiment remained. Would wealth change who he fundamentally was? But now he understood the deeper question beneath it. Could he integrate this new resource into his life while maintaining the values and connections that gave that life meaning? As he prepared to leave, James noticed his worn copy of The Great Gatsby on the coffee table, still marked with sticky notes for class discussions. He picked it up, remembering his students' insights about belonging and authenticity. Perhaps the real lesson wasn't about wealth itself, but about the courage to be fully oneself in all contexts, a challenge that transcended financial circumstances. James took the book with him as he closed the apartment door behind him, heading toward a future where his divided worlds would finally converge. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Principal Garcia's office, creating a brightness that contrasted with the heaviness James felt as he took the familiar seat across from her desk. On the table between them lay a printout of the Chicago Education Journal article. "So," Principal Garcia began, her expression unreadable, "it seems we have more to discuss than just your contract renewal." James nodded, a strange relief washing over him now that concealment was no longer an option. "I should have been more transparent with you, with everyone." "Yes, you should have," she agreed, then surprised him by adding, "though I suspected something had changed. 20 years in education gives you a sense for when someone's circumstances have shifted. You knew, not about the inheritance specifically, but small things, your sudden ability to find funding for the arts program, the way you stopped bringing lunch from home, how you offered to cover Elaine's classroom supplies without hesitation." She leaned forward. "Teachers notice patterns, James. It's what we do." James felt a flush of embarrassment. "I thought I was being careful. The question isn't why you kept it private, that's your right. The question is why you're here now, still teaching in a public high school when you could be anywhere, doing anything." The directness of her question cut through James's rehearsed explanations. "Because teaching matters to me," he answered simply. "Because helping students discover their voices through literature is still meaningful, inheritance or not." Principal Garcia studied him thoughtfully. "And the foundation work is an extension of that same commitment, not a replacement," James explained, finding clarity as he spoke. "I want to support structural changes that teachers like us have been advocating for years. But I don't want to lose the connection to the classroom either." A knock at the office door interrupted them. James turned to see several of his colleagues, Derek, Tanya, and Elaine, standing in the doorway, expressions ranging from confusion to concern. "Sorry to interrupt," Derek said, "but we need to talk to James." Principal Garcia glanced at James, who nodded. "Come in," she invited. "I think we're all due for an honest conversation." What followed was perhaps the most authentic hour James had experienced since receiving his inheritance. He explained the full situation, his uncle's unexpected bequest, his decision to maintain his existing life while processing the implications, and his growing discomfort with the deception. "So all those anonymous donations to the arts program, to my mother's medical fund, that was you?" Tanya asked, connecting dots that had previously seemed random. James nodded. I wanted to help without changing how people saw me. But you are different now, Elaine pointed out. Not because of the money itself, but because you have power and access that the rest of us don't. Pretending otherwise doesn't serve anyone. I'm still figuring out what that responsibility means, James admitted. Derek, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. You know what bothers me? Not that you're rich, good for you. It's that you didn't trust us enough to be honest. We've shared everything for years. Struggles, failures, the time I got fired from Harris High and you helped me find a new position. Why not share this? The hurt in his friend's voice made James wince. I was afraid it would change everything, and I needed time to figure out who I was in relation to this money before everyone else started defining me by it. Noble intentions, complicated execution, Principal Garcia observed. So where do we go from here? The question hung in the air, representing not just James's professional future, but the integration of his fractured life. I'd like to propose a compromise, James said, an idea taking shape as he spoke. I want to continue teaching, but perhaps with a modified schedule that allows me to also develop the foundation's work. Instead of hiding one role from the other, I could bring them together, use the classroom to inform the foundation's priorities, and the foundation's resources to support innovative teaching. Principal Garcia looked intrigued. A teacher-philanthropist model. Unusual, but potentially valuable for our students. Over the next hour, the conversation evolved from confrontation to collaboration. James's colleagues, once past their initial shock, began offering perspectives on how resources could most effectively support their educational community. Insights that no consultant or wealth advisor had provided. The after-school STEM program has been running on fumes, Derek noted. With proper funding and equipment, we could offer coding and robotics to students who have no access otherwise. And college visits for juniors, Tanya added. Most of our students have never set foot on a university campus before applying. By the time they left Principal Garcia's office, the outline of a new approach had emerged. One where James would teach part-time while developing foundation initiatives directly informed by classroom needs and teacher expertise. The transition wasn't seamless. Some colleagues were uncomfortable with the sudden revelation of James's wealth. A few parents requested their children be moved to different English classes, concerned about having an inexperienced philanthropist teaching their kids. The local paper ran a follow-up story questioning whether James's foundation would unduly influence public school priorities. But there were unexpected positives too. Students who had previously seen few connections between education and future opportunities began asking James about careers in nonprofits and social entrepreneurship. Several seniors requested recommendation letters for scholarship essays focused on community impact. By September, James had fully moved into his lakefront condo, no longer hiding his changed circumstances. He hosted a housewarming dinner for his closest friends, where the conversation initially centered awkwardly on the spectacular view before Derek finally broke the tension. Okay, elephant in the room. This place probably costs more than all our salaries combined for a decade. It's weird. But can we agree it's not the most interesting thing about tonight or about James? The laughter that followed released months of accumulated tension. The evening evolved into a planning session for a teacher-led community foundation that would operate alongside James's larger initiative, ensuring diverse perspectives guided the deployment of resources. Throughout fall semester, James settled into his new integrated life. He taught 3 English classes each morning, while afternoons were dedicated to foundation work, often conducted from a converted storage room at Westside High that Principal Garcia had repurposed as an office. The proximity allowed for constant cross-pollination of ideas between practice and policy. On a crisp October evening, James stood at the podium in Westside's auditorium, addressing an audience of students, parents, educators, and community members at the launch of the school's expanded after-school programs, the first major initiative funded by his foundation. When I unexpectedly inherited wealth last spring, I thought I needed to choose between 2 worlds, the familiar one of teaching and connections, or a new one of philanthropy and influence, he told the audience. I've learned that the most valuable perspective comes from the intersection of these worlds. He gestured to his colleagues seated in the front row. My fellow teachers reminded me that true impact requires both resources and relationship. That money can open doors, but only meaningful connection can invite people to walk through them. Looking out at his students, particularly those from the junior English class who had unwittingly helped him process his own relationship to wealth through their discussions of Gatsby, James continued, "Literature teaches us that character is revealed through choices, especially when facing unexpected circumstances. The past 6 months have been my own unexpected chapter. What I've learned is that wealth is not inherently transformative. It simply amplifies who we already are and what we already value." As the evening progressed into a community celebration, James found Principal Garcia by the refreshment table, observing the interactions with her characteristic attentiveness. "Still finding your balance?" she asked. "Every day," James acknowledged. "But it's a different kind of challenge now. Not hiding one life from another, but bringing them into productive tension." She nodded approvingly. "That's real integration, not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to engage with it honestly." She gestured toward a group of students demonstrating the new robotics equipment to younger children. And the results speak for themselves. Later that night, James stood on his condo balcony, looking out at the city lights reflected on Lake Michigan. He thought about the journey of the past 6 months, from the shock of inheritance to the secrecy of his experiment to the messy but rewarding process of integration. The most valuable insight hadn't been about wealth management or philanthropic strategies. It had been about the fundamental human need for authenticity and connection, something his students had been teaching him all along through their engagement with literature, if only he had recognized the parallel. His phone buzzed with a text from Kate. "Proud of you, brother. Uncle Harold would be too." James smiled, realizing that the inheritance's true value hadn't been the financial freedom it provided, but the journey of self-discovery it had prompted. A journey that continued to unfold as he learned to align his resources with his values, his advantages with his responsibilities, and his changing circumstances with his unchanging core. The experiment had ended, but the education continued. And that, perhaps, was the most amazing lesson of all.